Today's review is sponsored by Axel and Kevin, because we're gonna need some pugs, especially after watching this movie.
Watch it, Alan, I'm shooting.
Cannibal Holocaust. It's a pug. Hello everybody, as you can see I'm not in my typical location because I am taking care of Axel and Kevin for a few days. So typical disclaimer, I apologize if the lighting's off and if the audio is off. This is just the best place to film in this particular house. But anyway, yeah, we're going to be bothered by pugs throughout this review, and I think that's a good thing because today we're covering Cannibal Holocaust. Cannibal Holocaust is considered one of the most controversial movies ever made. There are long lists of movies that are considered controversial for one reason or another. As you get to the top of various lists, there are certain movies you expect to see. Faces of Death, a Serbian film, which I still have not watched because I know about one particular scene in that movie that bothers me. For those who have seen the movie or know about it, you know. I'll watch it eventually, but I just gotta build up to that. Salo, 120 Days of Sodom, you will usually find that at the top of controversial movies lists, mostly because the director Pier Paolo Pasolini was murdered shortly after the release of that movie. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there about that. I don't think it's as complicated as people make it out to be. But then you have Cannibal Holocaust, which you will usually find towards the top of controversial movies lists. And that's mostly because after the release of this film, the director, Ruggero Deodato, and his producer were arrested because people thought he actually murdered his actors. We'll get into that closer to the end of this video.
Perhaps I haven't made myself clear. But I refuse to have anything to do with this material.
And trigger warning before we get into this film. All the triggers, just to warn you, because there's a lot of disturbing content in this movie, which I am going to be talking about, so just trigger warning for all of it. Trigger warning, trigger warning, trigger warning. So just be ready for that. And with that, let's get into the movie. Cannibal Holocaust is an Italian horror movie directed by Ruggero Deodato. Many people consider this the first found-footage horror movie. And while it did heavily influence the found-footage genre, I don't consider it a full-fledged found-footage film. Try saying that 5 times. Mostly because the first half is not found footage and the second half is found footage. And the main character of our movie is the person watching the footage. So there's various reasons why I don't consider it an actual found footage movie, but it is a heavy influence on the found footage genre.
You're still shooting? Yeah! Do it now! I'm getting it all! Do it! Come on!
In the first half of this movie, we're following an anthropology professor named Harold Monroe. He's set out into the Amazon jungle in order to try and find this missing documentary film crew that had gone into this area known as the Green Inferno to do a documentary on cannibal tribes. They went missing, they haven't been seen since. As he gets further and further into the jungle, he encounters various tribes, learns of the misdeeds of the documentary film crew, finds out that they caused some bit of a mess out there, and he soon finds out that the film crew has been murdered by the cannibal tribe. He manages to get a hold of the footage and bring it back to civilization. In the second half of the movie, the television studio that sent these people out there wants to showcase their footage on television. So, for the second half of the movie, Professor Monroe watches the footage and sees all the atrocities that these people committed against the tribes, which led to their murders. This is where the found footage element comes into play.
Right! Don't you get it? We can never keep up with them in the jungle. This way, that buck will go slow enough to take us right to the village.
Cannibal Holocaust is a rough watch. It's one of the most disturbing, violent, unforgivable movies ever made, and it's one of my all-time favorite horror movies. I have it tied with The Beyond for my all-time favorite Italian horror movie. A few things to get out of the way before we dive into this film. First of all, there's a lot of stuff I cannot show on YouTube because it involves a lot of nudity and a lot of intense violence, and YouTube does not like that. I'm sure this video is going to get flagged regardless, but heads up for that. And second, we need to address the animal cruelty that takes place in this movie because this is sadly a staple of Italian cannibal movies. Now, there were immoral things done during the making of this film. Animal cruelty is one of them, and mistreatment of indigenous people was another. I do not condone either one of them, and there are people who will say, oh, well, the animals were eaten after they were killed for this film. I say, so what? The reason they were killed was because they wanted to put shock value into this movie. They were killed for the sake of entertainment, which I do not agree with. I will never condone what the filmmakers did for this movie. But the only reason I am able to watch it now, despite all that, is because this movie was made so long ago. I can't do anything about it now. The animals that were killed in this film are dead and gone, and what have you. There's nothing I can do about it now. All we can do is learn from the past so we don't repeat the mistakes in the future. We can acknowledge this is wrong, and we do not repeat it. Now that we have that out of the way, let's move on. The protagonist of this movie is Professor Harold Monroe. When he goes into the Amazon jungle, you can tell he's out of his element, but as the film goes on, he earns the respect of his guide.
You did it, goddammit. You just invited us to dinner.
Hey, what?
Monroe is the one trying to take the moral high ground throughout the film, especially when we get back to civilization, and you have this television studio that just wants to profit off the death of these filmmakers and the exploitation of primitive people. Monroe has a lot of dialogue about respecting primitive people and how the documentary film crew could be seen as savage from the point of view of these primitive tribes.
Ah, yes, that's typical Western thought. Civilized, isn't it? That's what Alan thought, and that's why he's dead. The Akumo Indian is a primitive, and he has to be respected as such.
This is the big theme of the movie, and it's a theme that's still relevant today. Looking down on people who you think are less than you and exploiting them for your own personal gain. Exploitation and sensationalism used to get better ratings instead of doing the right thing. Exploitation used for fame. These are all things we sadly still see today. In Cannibal Holocaust, the primitive tribes have these certain rituals and customs that civilized people would consider to be barbaric. But the cannibals are not the bad guys of the film. The villains of this movie are the documentary film crew. In Cannibal Holocaust, we see these primitive native people doing these customs and rituals that would seem barbaric to civilized society, like eating people, for example. But the cannibals are not the bad guys of this movie. The villains of this film are the documentary film crew, Faye, Jack, Mark, and their leader, Alan. It bugs me when viewers of this film view the documentary film crew as the protagonists of the movie. They're not. They're like the Firefly family from Devil's Rejects or Three from Hell, or Frank Zito from Maniac. They are the villains of this movie. We are following the bad guys. Alan and his crew are some of the best villains in horror movies, mostly because of the bait and switch that the movie puts us through. When we first see the documentary film crew, they seem like normal but ambitious people.
Well, there's only one thing that scares me.
And that's marriage.
He'd take me to the North Pole to put it off.
Oh, I'd say he succeeded this time, too.
Then we have Professor Monroe going into the jungle to try and find this missing film crew. He meets the native tribes, and he sees some of their barbaric rituals. And we, the audience, are put off by this because, yikes. Cannibalism is one of them, obviously. But it's made clear that the film crew has made a mess of things, and we're left wondering, what did they do to these native jungle folk? Then we get back to civilization, and before we really dive into the footage, we get a bit of a peek at what these people were like when they start interviewing members of the family, and they make it clear that these were not good people.
He pushed his people to the limit, demanding everything, including blood. And talk about paranoia. God have mercy on his soul, he was one ruthless son of a bitch.
The atrocities they commit in this film are hard to watch, and it's all done in the pursuit of fame.
But you know what finally convinced them? The chance to become famous. To reach that spot where time stopped 3,000 or 4,000 years ago.
This is something we still see today. You have pranksters on the internet that are going around harassing people or even assaulting people and hiding behind the whole, it's just a prank, bro. There was this thing a while back, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was a trend where people would run up behind old people and punch them in the back of their heads. Leave that down below what it was called. I can't remember what it was, but that's horrible. And let's not forget, when Logan Paul was in the suicide forest in Japan and he filmed a dead body, not caring that this was a human being, to him it was just a prop to use for his content. The need for content, clicks, engagement, notoriety, some form of fame can lead to some very bad things. That's the cautionary tale that Cannibal Holocaust looks at. How civilized people will cannibalize each other for their own pursuit of fame and their own personal gains.
I wonder who the real cannibals are.
There are many brutal scenes in Cannibal Holocaust. It's a movie that you will not be able to forget no matter how hard you try. The most infamous scene in this movie is the impaling scene. This was one of the moments that was referenced when Deodato and producer were being charged for murder. The documentary film crew has already committed quite a bit of abuse on some of the local tribes, and as they get further into the jungle, they capture a native girl of one of the cannibal tribes, and they rape her. This once again showing how little they view the lives of these people. After the assault, later on, they find the girl impaled on a pole, up her ass and out her mouth. And Alan just views this as another image for his film. There's that one moment during this scene where we see him smiling, and that says so much about his character.
Watch it, Alan. I'm shooting.
Oh, good Lord. It's unbelievable. It's horrible.
In his mind, this is not a human being. She's just another prop on his quest for fame. I would like to go more in depth about this scene, but I'm gonna do that in a later video because I could do a whole video on this scene alone. It's a scene that I've been fascinated by for such a long. I've studied this scene so many times. And like I said, I could do a whole video on this scene, but I'm gonna save that for a later video. I will do that in the future.
I can't understand the reason for such cruelty. It must have something to do with some obscure sexual rite, or with the almost profound respect these primitives have for virginity.
But this act is the final straw for the cannibal tribe. They then get their revenge on the filmmakers, and it leads to their murders. Watching these people get murdered, assaulted, dismembered, and eaten is very intense. And the found footage aspect only adds to the grittiness and the realism. It's a hard-hitting scene. It's that dedication to realism that eventually led to the director and the producer getting charged with murder. The film was shot on location in the Amazon jungle. The people they had playing the native tribes were played by actual native tribes of the area. And then here's the big thing. The people who played the documentary film crew, who we see get killed on camera, signed a contract saying that after this movie was made, they were not allowed to star in any other movies or contact their families for 1 whole year. I love this movie, but that's an insane ask. Of course, that contract was terminated when Deodato had to appear before a judge being charged with murder. He called the people in and said, look, we're going to cancel the contract because they thought I really killed you guys, so come in here and prove that you're still alive.
I'm not speaking as a scientist, but as the man in the street. This so-called documentary footage is offensive, it is dishonest, and above all, it is inhuman.
And that is the legacy of Cannibal Holocaust. I understand people not liking this film. It's very disturbing. It's intense and unforgiving. I never argue with people who say they hate this film. But I love this movie because I can never forget how it made me feel when I watched it. It punched me not just in the gut, but deeper than that. The movie's message is still relevant today. It was relevant when it came out, and it's still relevant today. Cannibal Holocaust has left its mark on film history. When a movie leaves this much of an impact, this much of a hard impact, and that impact continues for decades after the film's release, it becomes history. Cannibal Holocaust is history. And with that, let's get to the Grindhouse rankings. We've got a body count of 33, give or take. Things get messy as the film goes on. The kills consist of, but are not limited to, death by spears, death by gunshots, being bludgeoned to death, and the infamous impaling scene. It reaches the cannibal requirements with flesh-eating, jungle settings, and a lot of brutality. There's a lot of nudity in this flick, both male and female, and some genitals are treated badly. The movie is so brutal. There are plenty of scenes that are hard to watch. Professor Monroe is a good protagonist. We're on his side as he advocates for the primitive tribes. And the documentary film crew are good villains. The movie does a good job at flipping our perspective of them as the movie goes on. The impaling scene is disturbing, but so well done. I've studied this scene many times, and it still fascinates me. I will never be okay with the animal cruelty. It doesn't add anything to the movie for me, and I will never be okay with animals being killed for the sake of a movie. But even with that, this is still a great horror movie that not everyone needs to see. I'm giving Cannibal Holocaust a 6 out of 5. This movie had a huge impact on me, but I would strongly recommend doing some research first before checking it out, just to see if you would be okay with it. As always, I want to thank all of you for continuing to watch and support this channel. I don't really have a question for this particular review to ask you guys, but I do have just a request. Because this video is probably going to get flagged due to the content, please support this video. I truly, truly appreciate it. Thank you all so much. This is the Maniac, Kevin, and Axel, who's asleep over there, who doesn't want to be woken up, here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die. Because, like I said, we need some pugs after this movie.